All right, fifth grade, happy Friday. As I had been kind of previewing, teasing a little bit about what's going to be happening today, we talked about the colonists. Yesterday, we talked about who the different groups were, the patriots and the loyalists, okay? And so if you are somebody who did not finish that from yesterday, please make sure that that is done first before you work on this, okay? So today, now we're going to start talking about a war that happened in the colonies. So in where today we call the United States of America, in our country, there was a war that was very big. And we're going to talk about how it really was the First World War. Now, it wasn't literally World War One. Okay, World War One happened about 150, 200 years later. But this was really the first war that really involved pretty much most of the world. A lot of Europe, there was some fighting in Africa. There were some Asian countries that were involved. So this was a really big war. All right, we're going to talk about it today. Okay, so today we're just going to do a little bit of a, I don't want to say a basic introduction, but kind of an introduction here. Just kind of talk about when this war took place, who were the different sides, what was the point, right? Obviously, when you fight for something, obviously there's something that you're fighting over, so we got to talk about that today. Okay, so the first thing that I do want to show you here is a map. Okay, so over here in the red, this red should look very familiar to you. These are the 13 colonies. Now we've talked about them, right? We talked about Pennsylvania, Georgia's down here, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. A lot of these colonies here should look familiar. Some of these cities should look familiar too. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Very familiar names for you. Okay, so those people that we talked about yesterday, the colonists, those patriots and loyalists, they lived here in the red. Okay, there was slavery in the red as well. Okay, in the blue, that is land that is owned by, at this time, the French. Okay, so people from France, they were kind of setting up little forts. Okay, so not really big cities like Boston, New York, but little forts, kind of like little towns. They worked very closely with the Native Americans. They were friends with the Native Americans. They wanted to get along with the Native Americans. And they lived over here in the blue. Okay? Now, where the 7 Years' War mostly takes place, the place that we are going to talk about the most, is kind of right here in the middle. Right here in the middle, there's kind of this area right here that they're fighting over. They want it. All right? It's good land for farming, for a lot of different things, for cattle, for they wanted it. All right, so the British wanted it. So the people in the colonies, the British, they really wanted it. Also, the French really wanted it. So they're going to fight over it. Okay. Now, some of these red cities here should look familiar. Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, like I said. Some of these blue ones here should look very familiar too. Okay. So if you see, like right here, so now these white lines, these are the state outlines today. Back in the 16 and 1700s, there were no lines, so they just put this here on this map to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like today. But if you see right here, like here, one of these French forts, it's Fort d'Etoile, okay, a French fort. Today, we wouldn't call it Fort d'Etoile, we would call it Detroit. Okay, that probably sounds familiar. Okay, see one right here, Fort St. Louis. Today, we would call that the city, St. Louis. Okay, down here at the very bottom of, kind of down here in the Gulf of Mexico, La Nouvelle-Orléans. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's kind of what they called it. Today, we would call this New Orleans. All right, those are cities that are in our country now, but they were owned by the French. They were started by French people. Okay, so like I said, 7 Years' War, fighting over this land right in the middle. Okay, so what was the 7 Years' War? A war between many countries of the world. Okay. Now, the part, like I said, that we're going to talk about is mostly the French against the British. Okay, fighting for this little area here in yellow. The Ohio River Valley is what it's called. This blue line is the Ohio River. That's still there today. But they're fighting over this little land right here. Okay. But if I may, just really quick, look over here. Here are the sides of the 7 Years' War. It was very complex. There were a lot of different things that were happening in the world. Obviously, the Ohio River Valley that they're fighting over is just one small part of the world, so why was the whole world getting involved? All right, and so actually there were fights all over the world, okay? But mostly the biggest part of the fight were the British against the French, okay? So really what we have here is we have the British, the Prussians, that's not even a thing anymore, and Hanover against the French, the Austrians, the Swedes from Sweden, Saxony, Russia, and eventually Spain. Okay, so there's a lot of different countries involved here. Really what we're talking about mostly is France against Britain, France against England. Okay, so now when was the 7 Years' War? Kind of a weird thing. Now it's the 7 Years' War, right? So you would think, hey, 7 Years' War, it was 7 years. It was technically, so depends on where you were. So 1756 to 1763. So that right there, that is 7 years. It depends on where the fighting was. So this battle, this part of the war that we're talking about, is actually 7 years. But if you look at different places in Europe, it actually went longer than that. But we still call it the 7 Years' War. Okay, so 1756 to 1763. That's when the 7 Years' War took place. Okay. This war is super important. We'll talk more about it. We'll talk about kind of the biggest thing about this war was it's so expensive. Okay, and we'll talk about how that really led to the United States becoming a country. So here we are today, the United States. We speak English because we used to be part of England, right? If this 7 Years' War was different, if the winner was a different country, our country today would look very different. Very, very different. Okay? Because if you look back at this map, the blue is the French. Where my mouse is going, that's Minnesota. Oops. All right, so if this war went differently here in Minnesota, I might be speaking French to you right now and not English. Okay, so why was there a war? The British and the French fought for the Ohio River Valley. Okay, the British and the French fought for the Ohio River Valley. And that's what it is right there. That's the Ohio River Valley. That's still there today. There's a lot of cities there today in the United States, like Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Nashville, a lot, very many, Louisville. Okay. Now, last thing for today, we got to talk about the two sides of the 7 Years' War. Okay. Now, I did show you there's all these countries here. Very cool, a lot of them, a big world war. But we're going to talk about a few very basic ones. Kind of just really about the ones that happened here in this part of the world. Okay, like if you were somebody who was from Sweden or Spain, you probably didn't fight over here. Okay, mostly just the French and the British did. Okay, also on this map here, the orange that is land that belongs to Spain. Back then, they did not fight in this part of the war here. Okay. Okay. So the French, really what we have here on this side of the battle. Okay. We had the French, of course. The French army, Native American tribes, in North America. Okay, so we had the French army and the Native American tribes in North America. Okay, now we talked about how the French got along with the Native Americans. Okay, so the British were kind of pushing them out, kicking them out of where they wanted to be, and the French were kind of accepting them, learning from them, helping them as people and not trying to get rid of them. Okay, so really when we talk about the 7 Years' War, the French and the Native Americans were friends. Okay, and the French kind of made a promise to the Native Americans and said, you know what, you help us fight, we'll make sure that those English people don't push you around anymore. Okay, if we win, we'll get them out of there, we'll give them your land back. Okay, on the English side, we have the English army. And now we'll think back to what we learned yesterday. So we have the English army, so the army that was there with the king. Also, patriots. So these are the people that lived in the colonies that did not like the king. They were still asked to go and fight in the 7 Years' War. And very many of them still did. They didn't like it. They thought, this is not our war to fight. This is the king's war, so why are we fighting? But they still fought. A lot of patriots. And then definitely a lot of loyalists. So remember, the loyalists are the group of people that live in the colonies that are loyal to the king. They love the king, think he's a great guy. Think there's nothing wrong with him. Okay, so the English army, patriots, loyalists, so people that live in the colonies, and African American slaves. Okay. Obviously, being slaves, they did not have an option. They didn't have a choice. They were forced to fight, and if they fought and the war was over, they didn't come home and then were free, then they had to go back and be slaves. So a lot of people look back to this and say this was super sad that African American slaves who didn't want to fight and Native Americans who had their lives being taken away from them, this was a very sad war that they were fighting each other, when really they were both just trying to survive. Okay, so those are the two sides of the 7 Years' War. Okay, so like we said, there's the French, okay, and the English. Right, so I am going to French flag here. I'm going to copy it. You don't have to do this. You should already see yours on your slides here, but this is the French flag. France, and then the English flag. The United Kingdom, Britain, remember those are all very similar. Those are the same thing. Really for everything that we're learning. Okay, so then here is the English flag. Right, so here are the two sides. Remember that the blue on this map, these are the French. Okay. And then the red, these are the English colonies here. And that is what the 7 Years' War is all about. Okay, we're going to talk about what happens here. There's a couple really big fights that happen. But really the biggest thing that happens is what happens afterwards. Okay, so after the war, there's kind of some very important things that happen that we can look at. And we can point directly to those things and say, wow, that's the reason why the United States became its own country. Okay? So, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I want to make sure that we spend some good time on this war. It's very important. A lot of people died. A lot of sad stories. A lot of very heroic stories. But that's where we're going next. All right? 7 Years' War. So if you have any questions, come to office hours, 10:05. Otherwise, I will see you at our Google Meet at your normal time.